They told him he was too quiet, too different, too invisible to ever matter. But when the world turned its back on James Steve, he didn't shrink. He rose. Now, as the youngest faculty member at the University of Maine, he's about to prove that genius isn't defined by appearance, and greatness isn't limited by the world's expectations. Go nowhere as this great story unfolds. You are highly appreciated for watching and engaging in this particular series. Do watch other ones in our channel to get informed and entertained. Now, let's begin. The middle school building in the small town stood weathered by time. The bricks of the old school had seen generations of children pass through its doors, their footsteps echoing through the long halls. Faded paint chipped from the walls, and cracked windows let in only bits of sunlight that tried to warm the cold, empty spaces. The classrooms were cramped and crowded, the desks old and creaky, but despite the peeling walls and the worn-out textbooks, there was a spark of hope within the children. They came to school with the belief that education could change their futures, even when the world outside seemed set against them. In room 202, Ms. Riley stood at the front of the class, her arms folded tightly across her chest. Her short, tight curls framed a face that was usually stern, and the glasses perched low on her nose only added to the air of authority she carried. Ms. Riley prided herself on maintaining order, believing that discipline was the key to success. But there was a flaw in her teaching philosophy. She often saw students not for their potential, but for what they appeared to be. And that was where James Steve, sitting quietly in the back of the room, fell through the cracks. At 13, James was a black boy with worn-out clothes that looked a size too big for him, his hair unkempt, and his eyes often downcast. He carried the weight of his socio-economic background like a shadow, but there was something deeper, a quiet brilliance that none of his classmates or teachers saw. James didn't fit the mold. He wasn't loud or outgoing like the others, and he wasn't quick to raise his hand in class. Instead, he kept to himself, often scribbling numbers in the margins of his notebook when he was supposed to be paying attention. Raised by his father, Mr. Steve, who worked as an accountant in a brewery that had gone bankrupt years ago, James had learned to value hard work and perseverance. But that was all anyone could see about him, his worn-out clothes and his father's old job. They never bothered to notice what James was capable of beyond the surface. Ms. Riley, of course, was no exception. She often called on the more outspoken students to answer questions and barely glanced at James. He was, to her, just another quiet student who didn't seem to care about his education. She assumed he was lazy, uninterested, and, worst of all, incapable. That day, the class was studying quadratic equations, something James had mastered long before most of his peers. He had learned the basics from his father, who had taught him to balance budgets and analyze numbers. James had never cared much for being praised or seeking attention. He was more interested in the numbers themselves, how they fit together, how they told a story. But the world didn't want to listen to that story. It was in this environment of misunderstanding that Ms. Riley made her fateful decision. "James," she called sharply, looking over her glasses. "Come up and solve this quadratic equation for the class." She wrote a complicated expression on the board, her voice filled with an air of authority. "Let's see if you can handle this." James felt a jolt of panic run through him. He knew the answer. He knew exactly how to solve the equation. But the heat of the moment froze him. The room grew still as every pair of eyes turned toward him. He stood up slowly, trying to suppress the overwhelming feeling of embarrassment that washed over him. His hand shook slightly as he walked to the board. As he reached for the chalk, Ms. Riley's voice followed him, a subtle sneer beneath her words. "Take your time, James." She said it with mocking patience, as though she didn't believe he had the ability to solve the equation. The class shifted in their seats. The giggles started. James stared at the equation on the board, his mind racing. He knew the solution. He could solve this in seconds, but how could he prove it without risking more ridicule? The class, so quick to judge, wouldn't understand if he corrected the equation. What would happen if he made a mistake, though? He had to get it right, no matter what. His father had always told him to take his time with problems, but now there was no time. He began to write. Ms. Riley's words still rang in his ears, but they were starting to fade. The numbers in front of him were the only thing that mattered. As he worked through the steps, he realized something. There was an error in the equation Ms. Riley had written, one that he couldn't ignore. The coefficients didn't line up. There was a mistake, but if he pointed it out, he would be challenging her in front of the class. She might humiliate him even more. He hesitated. The whispers from his classmates grew louder, and a few of the braver students snickered. James could hear them, but he pushed the noise aside. He had learned long ago to block out the voices of others when they tried to define him. But this was different. Ms. Riley was the teacher, and her opinion mattered, didn't it? But then he remembered his father's words again. You never let anyone make you doubt what you know, James. With a deep breath, he finished solving the equation. But then, he wrote something different. James turned to the class, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. Actually, Ms. Riley, there's an error in the equation. His voice was low but clear. It should be. There was a moment of silence. James could feel the eyes of the class boring into him, waiting for him to fall. He continued to explain, calmly and carefully, showing them the error in the original equation and the correct steps to solving it. The classroom went still, the whispering completely stopped. Ms. Riley's face twisted into a look of disbelief. She walked toward the board, her expression faltering as she realized that James was right. But rather than admitting her mistake, she straightened up, her voice tight. James, you're disrupting my class. Sit down. The class was silent. The tension hung in the air like an unspoken truth, but no one said anything. James returned to his seat, his chest heavy, the weight of Ms. Riley's harshness sinking in, but something inside of him had changed. He had spoken out. Despite her attempt to silence him, he had proven his worth in front of everyone, even if no one else realized it yet. He was more than they thought. And that was just the beginning. After the class that day, James walked home in silence. His shoulders were slumped, his chest heavy with the weight of what had just happened. The cruel dismissal from Ms. Riley still echoed in his mind. She had dismissed him in front of everyone, not just for his misunderstanding, but for daring to correct her. And while the class might have laughed or whispered in the background, James couldn't shake the sting of her words. Sit down, James. You're disrupting my class. The rest of the day was a blur. He walked into his room and shut the door behind him. As he often did, the familiar comfort of his math books and scribbled notes offered no relief. His mind was too busy replaying the moment, the way the other students had looked at him, the feeling of being an outsider. He wasn't the kind of kid who fit in, the kind who made friends easily. His clothes were worn, his hair unkempt, and his silence only made him seem more distant. But none of that mattered. What mattered was the work he could do, and no one, least of all Ms. Riley, seemed to care about that. He sat down at his desk, his hands shaking as he opened his notebook. The page was filled with quadratic equations, simple to him but impossible to others. It didn't matter now. He felt like a ghost in his own classroom, invisible to the world, unnoticed except for his mistakes. But even in his isolation, James couldn't ignore the fire inside him. His mind craved the equations, the answers that were always waiting for him. At the dinner table that evening, James's father, Mr. Steve, noticed the look on his son's face. He could see it in his eyes. Something was weighing heavily on him. Mr. Steve, a man with hands calloused from years of hard work in the accounting department of a now bankrupt brewery, wasn't the kind of person to leave his son's troubles unaddressed. James, what's wrong? Mr. Steve asked softly, his voice full of concern. James hesitated, his hands pushing the food around on his plate, but finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Ms. Riley. She doesn't think I know anything. She humiliated me today in front of the class. She called me lazy and said I couldn't do the work. He looked down, staring at his plate, trying to hide the sting of the words. I tried to correct her, but she got mad. I think she hates me. Mr. Steve was quiet for a moment, his wise eyes scanning his son. He could see the hurt in James's face, the same hurt he had seen in his own youth, the same struggle he had faced. But he knew how to get through it. He knew that education was the key, but it wasn't just about solving math problems. It was about resilience, about standing up when the world tried to push you down. Son, I know it's hard. Mr. Steve's voice was gentle but firm. But you've got something that no one can take from you. Not Ms. Riley, not anyone. You've got a gift. Keep working hard, and let that be what speaks for you. People might not see it now, but they will. You just keep pushing forward. James nodded, but it was hard to feel hopeful. Ms. Riley's treatment wasn't just a one-time thing. It was part of a pattern. The next day, she ignored him completely. She never called on him in class, even though he knew the answers to every question she asked. When she handed out group assignments, she made sure James was always assigned the least important tasks, relegated to quietly watching from the side. The rest of the class noticed too. Some of the students, like Jake, would glance over and mock him under their breath, calling him the quiet kid or the nerd. But worse than their mocking was the way Ms. Riley allowed it to happen. She didn't intervene. She didn't stop the teasing. In fact, she encouraged it by never giving James the opportunity to show what he could do. James began to feel like a shadow. In a room full of faces, he was no one. Nothing more than a name on a seating chart. The spark he had for math, the talent that burned inside him, started to dim. He was afraid that if he spoke up again, it would only make things worse. And so, he retreated. He became quieter, more withdrawn. He didn't want to draw attention to himself. It felt safer that way. But that wasn't the answer. The longer he kept silent, the more he felt like he was suffocating under the weight of injustice. He had every right to speak, to defend himself and his abilities. So, after weeks of ridicule and isolation, James finally found the courage to do what he had been afraid of all along. He went to the principal. The principal's office was just as he remembered it from his previous visits, sterile and cold. But today, it felt different. This wasn't about some minor infraction. This was about justice. James explained everything to Principal Roberts, his voice shaking but steady. He told him about Ms. Riley's treatment, the way she had humiliated him in front of the class, the way she had always treated him as if he didn't matter. He shared how he had corrected her during class, and how instead of being recognized for his intelligence, he had been punished. Principal Roberts was quiet for a long time. He listened, and then he nodded, his face grim. James, I'm sorry this happened to you. You're right to come forward. No student should feel like they're invisible or worthless. I will look into this and take appropriate action. Thank you for being brave enough to speak up ***. The next day, Ms. Riley was called into the principal's office, and after an investigation into her behavior, she was removed from the classroom. It wasn't just the students who had noticed her prejudice. It was now official. James, though still feeling the sting of the past weeks, had stood up for himself, and it was that courage that would carry him forward. It was the first step toward showing not just Ms. Riley, but the world, that he wasn't invisible. He had something no one could take away: his mind and his determination. After the incident with Ms. Riley, the school was abuzz with whispers. The students had already heard that the strict teacher would no longer be returning, and some felt a sense of relief, others curiosity. It didn't take long before the school hired a new teacher to take her place. His name was Mr. Carter, a young, passionate black man in his late 20s, fresh out of college. He wasn't just another teacher. He was someone who truly cared about his students and was determined to make a difference. He had a vision, one where every student's potential was nurtured, not just those who fit the traditional mold. The first day Mr. Carter entered the classroom, he exuded an energy that filled the room. He didn't immediately stand behind the desk and launch into the day's lesson. Instead, he walked around, engaging with the students, asking them about their interests, and encouraging them to be themselves. There was no judgment in his eyes, only the open curiosity of someone who was excited to teach and learn from his students. When he first laid eyes on James, sitting quietly in the back corner, he noticed something different. James was the quiet one, the one who seemed to disappear into the background, often overlooked by both students and teachers alike. But Mr. Carter saw it immediately. The spark in James's eyes, the concentration that no one else had taken the time to notice. "James, right," Mr. Carter said as he made his way to the back of the classroom, where James sat. "I've heard a lot of good things about you. I'm excited to have you in my class." James looked up, startled by the attention, but managed to nod. He wasn't used to being recognized for anything positive, especially not in a place where his appearance and silence often led people to believe he was just another struggling student. But Mr. Carter wasn't like the others. He didn't look at James as a problem student. He looked at him as someone who could be something great. The next few weeks in Mr. Carter's class were a revelation for James. He found himself starting to open up, not just in terms of participating, but in embracing his own gifts. Mr. Carter noticed the way James would quietly solve equations in the margins of his notebook, or the quick scribbles of math problems that seemed to be too advanced for someone his age. He saw a natural aptitude for mathematics in James, a brilliance that had been buried beneath years of doubt and neglect. One day, Mr. Carter walked up to James, a challenging quadratic equation written in front of the class. "James," he said, "I'd like you to take a crack at this one. It's a bit tougher than what we're doing, but I know you can handle it." The class went silent as James walked to the board. The equation in front of him was complicated. It was beyond the scope of what most of his classmates were learning. As he started solving it, the classroom seemed to fade away. His hand moved quickly, yet carefully, through the steps, as if the numbers spoke to him directly. Within minutes, the solution appeared on the board. X equals 4 and x equals -2. There was no hesitation in James's handwriting, no uncertainty. The class stared in stunned silence, watching as James calmly returned to his seat, his work complete. Mr. Carter watched, a slow smile crossing his face. He had known there was something special about James, but now he was sure. This wasn't just a student who could memorize formulas and get answers. This was a student who had an advanced understanding of mathematics, far beyond his age. After class, Mr. Carter approached James, his eyes gleaming with pride. "James, that was incredible. You're more than just good at math. You're a natural. Have you ever thought about studying it at a deeper level? We can explore some more advanced stuff if you're up for it." James looked up, unsure of how to respond. No one had ever spoken to him like this before. No one had ever seen him for what he truly was, a mathematician in the making. I never thought about it," James admitted, his voice still soft. "I've always been told that I'm not good enough, or that my background doesn't matter." "Well, it's time to forget all that," Mr. Carter said with a grin. "We're going to work on some advanced quadratic equations, calculus, and even theoretical math. You're going to excel, James. Trust me." James felt a rush of hope he had never known. With Mr. Carter's guidance, James blossomed. He no longer kept to the back of the class, hiding his brilliance. He excelled in every lesson Mr. Carter gave him, from algebra to calculus, and his confidence grew. More importantly, he began helping others. When his classmates struggled with math, James was there, explaining things in a way that made sense, teaching them the same way Mr. Carter had taught him. As the year went on, James's talents became undeniable. He not only earned top grades, but also received a scholarship to attend a prestigious university to study mathematics. Meanwhile, Ms. Riley's actions were investigated after complaints from both James and other students. The school's administration, now fully aware of her mistreatment of James and others, made the decision to remove her from the classroom. A new initiative was put in place to address prejudices and biases in education, ensuring that no student would ever feel invisible or dismissed again. After years of hard work, James Steve stood proudly at the podium on the day of his high school graduation. The bright sun streamed through the windows of the gymnasium, casting long shadows across the rows of chairs filled with family members, teachers, and classmates. James's heart raced with emotion, and he couldn't help but glance over at his father, Mr. Steve, who had a tear in his eye. It was a quiet moment, but one that carried a lifetime of struggle and sacrifice. The day had finally come. James had graduated with distinction, a full scholarship to the University of Maine, and an invitation to join the prestigious mathematics department as a faculty member. He had made it. Against all odds, James had overcome the limitations imposed on him by society, by the cruelty of Ms. Riley, by his classmates' mockery, and even by his own self-doubt. He was no longer the quiet boy who hid in the back of the classroom. He was a scholar, a future mathematician, and above all, a leader. At the University of Maine, James excelled in his studies, immersing himself in the world of mathematical theory, calculus, and algebra. His brilliance was undeniable, and soon he earned a teaching position within the university's Department of Mathematics. Mr. Carter, his former teacher, now a respected professor, was a frequent mentor and friend, guiding James as he navigated his new role as both a student and an educator. The partnership between James and Mr. Carter, founded on trust, encouragement, and shared experiences, became a force of change at the university. But James didn't forget the people who had shaped him. His parents, especially his father, had instilled in him the values of hard work, perseverance, and the belief that anyone could achieve greatness, no matter their background. James knew that his success wasn't just about his personal journey, but about opening doors for others who came from underprivileged backgrounds like him. With the support of Mr. Carter and several university partners, James founded the Steve Carter Foundation, a nonprofit organization aimed at providing scholarships and mentorship to young students who showed talent and potential, but lacked the resources or opportunities to pursue their dreams. The foundation quickly gained momentum, attracting donors, mentors, and students who had similar struggles to James. It didn't matter where you came from. It was about where you were going. The foundation wasn't just a way to give back. It was James's way of ensuring that no child, no student, would ever be underestimated the way he had been. It became a place for young minds to flourish, where mathematics and science were not just subjects to be taught, but passions to be nurtured. As the foundation grew, James watched as students, once written off by society, began to thrive. Many went on to receive scholarships to top universities, pursue careers in engineering and physics, and eventually return to mentor the next generation of students. James's vision had come to life. Talent was not defined by your background, but by your passion, hard work, and dedication. Years later, James stood in front of a classroom full of students, his fingers lightly grazing the chalkboard. He had become more than just a teacher. He had become a leader, a mentor, and a beacon of hope for those who had once been overlooked. He knew the importance of being seen, of being heard. And so he made sure his students felt that same sense of recognition and respect. As he wrote an equation on the board, the familiar feeling of calculation and discovery filled him with a quiet satisfaction. The same equations that had once terrified him were now his tools for change. As the students followed along, he shared his story. The story of how he had been humiliated, how he had been told that his potential didn't matter, how he had fought for a chance to prove himself. And now he was giving them that same opportunity. "I know what it's like," James said, his voice steady but full of emotion. "I've been in your shoes. I know what it feels like to be ignored, to be laughed at, and to be dismissed. But I'm here to tell you, your potential is real. And if you work hard, you will succeed. No one can take that from you." The students listened, some with wide eyes, others with a sense of disbelief. They couldn't yet understand the full weight of James's words, but they would soon. And over time, many of them would look back on that moment and realize that they, too, were more than their appearances, more than the expectations placed on them. They were capable of greatness, just like James had been. James had become the teacher he had always wanted, someone who saw beyond the surface, someone who saw the hidden potential in every student. He had become a mathematician, a leader, and most importantly, a mentor who would never again let anyone feel the way he had once felt. He knew now that the true power of education wasn't in the lessons taught in books. It was in the way it changed lives, the way it could transform anyone who had the courage to reach for it. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Let us know in the comments where you are watching from. See you in the next series.